Welcome to Sustainable Packaging with Cory Connors. My guest today is Mr. Jamie McCroskery, is the co-founder and CEO at Bluebird Climate. Hey, Jamie, welcome.
Nice to see you, Cory.
Thank you so much for taking some time to be with us today.
Yeah, of course. I love talking about sustainability and sustainability packaging. So just another day.
Yes, we're fellow nerds that way. I hope the people of the audience appreciate that. But tell us about your background. How did you get into this world of LCAs and sustainability and start this new company?
Yes. I guess I'll give the personal background first. So my training is really in neuroscience and business, which is an odd combination, admittedly. But the idea is to understand something technical and then wrap that in business to bring nice things to the market, because you need to understand both business and science to really make innovation on the hardware front. I, in between wanting to go to medical school, actually got sucked into the world of technology. Had a big lever to make an impact. So I worked at companies like Dropbox, a bunch of other bigger ones that you can recognize. And I realized that a lot of what technology companies do is solve functional problems, but people make up their minds about what to buy for all sorts of emotional reasons, and consumer brands really understand that. So I ended up going to work at Glossier in New York to lead part of their technology department. And that's actually where I saw a lot of the sustainability challenges happening. It's like all of their customers really cared about it. Internally, it was really hard to even just make basic sustainability decisions because it's complicated and you're trying to get products out the door. So how do you do that in real time in a way that's data-based and accurate, not greenwashing?
Yeah.
And the key part for me, I teach rock climbing and mountaineering classes for kids. And I had gone to Sierra Nevada and the Cascades every summer and seen a lot of my favorite routes kind of have these glaciers that were receding like visibly year over year. And that combined with seeing this potential for impact at Glossier, oh wow, okay, I think it's time to actually devote some real effort here and create a company around it. So, my background is technology. I have a bunch of other co-founders who have worked in LCAs, Patagonia, and bringing the company together to really solve these challenges for consumer brands like Glossier.
It's exciting what you guys are doing. I think I understand what you're doing, but I'd like to explain it to the audience from your perspective. Can you tell us what Bluebird does and how you do it?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's funny. It's like I love hearing the pitch back to us, but yeah, I'll just give it to the audience from the horse's mouth. Yeah, so at Bluebird Climate, we essentially make it easy to produce low carbon consumer goods. So think, apparel, beauty, personal care, and then really tell your customers about it to bring them along with the journey. Ideally, you're making a lot of sustainability choices that are really good. A lot of them aren't visible because they're hidden in the supply chain, which is where the LCA comes in. Right. It's important to essentially explain why you're making these choices and quote unquote get credit for it in the market. So, what we do is we make it really easy to essentially measure, improve, and communicate the sustainability of your products. That means recyclability, end of life, and also, the core is carbon emissions as well from an end-to-end standpoint.
That's fascinating. And I was at the SpecRight summit last week, and we were talking about 90% of companies that have made promises for sustainable improvements will not meet their goals. And that's by, I think it was made that John from Gartner made that statement. And wow, that is a big number.
Yeah, well, there's a reason why timelines for these are so long.
Yep.
You can draw some parallels to political administrations, but yes, there's cynical views for that. There's also hopeful views in that innovation happens over the timeline, and there will be more solutions and also focus from the market to put some pressure on hitting those goals over time.
It's really exciting what you guys are doing. I was thrilled that you agreed to be on. Can you tell us what's something that you've seen perform really well in an LCA as far as packaging goes?
Yeah, and the background on the LCA, I don't know if your audience, how familiar they are. So, and also I just want to mention one quick thing about the company too. So the commitments around sustainability are fascinating to see across the market. They primarily come from these large conglomerates that have sustainability teams. There's executive buy-in pressure from the Larry Finks and BlackRocks of the world.
Yeah.
And they're making commitments externally to say, hey, by 2030, 2050, we want to be carbon neutral, or however they want to define it. But, if you look at the market, if you're smaller than a Unilever, you might not have a sustainability, and you
Right.
certainly aren't going to be hiring consultants to essentially like help you during product development on making sustainable choices. So what we do is actually geared towards the small, medium-sized consumer brands who don't have the sustainability teams, and even if they do, they don't want to hire extra. So we give them the like in-house knowledge without having to hire, and then the ability to like, really communicate externally. So we're trying to fill the hole, say like, hey, previously if you had to have like a $30 million sustainability team to access LCAs and sustainability knowledge, now we're making it available to like kind of everyone, is the hope.
That's a huge niche that needs to be filled. So I hear from companies all the time that are less than $30 million companies, and they need help. How do we make our packaging more sustainable? How do we make our company more sustainable? And so it sounds like you guys are filling that void. Nice job.
Yes. And the thing that from a theory of change standpoint, you can see a lot of innovation happening in these small companies because they're the ones who are taking the risks to go with some novel materials. And that actually, once those products get out to me, that actually puts pressure on the bigger guys to hit their goals as well. So that's
100%.
Why we're working with them. Anyway, but to your question about what scores well. So I think there's two ways, sustainability means everything and nothing. It's quite the conundrum, but there's two ways that we see.
Very true.
We see people making decisions and talking about sustainability. Let's just look at it from a carbon and circularity standpoint, recyclability, end of life, biodegradability. A lot of what you see in the market is reference to attributes of sustainability. So, hey, I'm going to buy this packaging that's at best, recycled pulp or is biodegradable. It's really then hard to look at those attributes and say, like, well, is that like net a good thing for my company that's buying this? Yep. And in order to answer that question, you actually have to use a life cycle assessment, which looks at your supply chain and says, like, hey, if you have distribution centers in the US and vendors in China, where is the optimal place to buy this thing and what kind of materials? Because it all really depends on your own supply chain. For example, we see companies asking us all the time, like, hey, should I use post-consumer recycled aluminum tubes or virgin plastic? Yeah. The answer is, it kind of depends how you're shipping it because the weight really, really matters. If you're trying to buy something that's PCR in China and you're air freighting it, that air freight to the US is going to be order of magnitude more of a carbon impact than the material choice you're making. So that's where the life cycle assessment comes in and says, hey, let's look all the way from the materials that are being produced, ultimately mined, chopped down or grown, manufactured, transported, and then served to your end consumer, rather than just looking at, oh, is it biodegradable or not?
You're singing to the choir here. I love what you're saying. It's so true. So many times people say, oh, well, we're using biodegradable packaging, so we're sustainable and you're welcome. Well, let's look at the whole life cycle of what you're doing. Are you shipping it around the world? Or does it have to? I talked to another person that was using boxes for water, and they said they have to ship it to Israel, and then they have to print it there, and then it gets shipped back to have a coating added, and then it gets shipped to another place to be filled. And it's like, okay, yeah, paper is sustainable, but is air freight and then sea freight and then sea freight and then land freight, does that negate all of the positives of the material change? And I think the answer is yes. It sounds like you agree.
Yeah, and that's why I didn't give a direct answer on like what kind of material. So a lot of companies we work with, just as like an example here. So a canonical beauty product, which is some sort of goop wrapped in plastic, transported around a bunch, and then wrapped in paper and then shipped again. From a carbon emission standpoint, a lot of times 70% of that comes from transportation. And so honestly, it's a really big opportunity to say like, oh wow, we can't really get more than 50% PCR because there are stability issues. It's Unilever's buying up all the stock, so we can't afford it. It's like, okay, well, that's okay. Do what you can from a material standpoint, which we'll talk about in a second. But here's this whole other thing that you can address, which is transportation. And that often does lead to carbon and cost savings as well. And it doesn't really affect a lot of better relationships and what your customers expect, and it's really hidden, which is actually a really nice thing because it can surprise and delight customers as well if you tell them about it. But to your question, Cory, about like what kind of it really depends on the supply chain and the products we're talking about, but generally recycled materials that are transported not a long distance or by boat is pretty much almost always kind of the best thing. That does change over time because new materials come out. You have some carbon negative kelp derived plastics that are really interesting.
Yeah.
Generally, that's the rule of thumb, though. And also making sure that's designed for recyclability, which is a huge piece that we can get into as well.
That's amazing to hear. And I've heard that shipping via train is very sustainable. Is that still the case? Is that more sustainable than a single?
It depends where it's going to and coming from, really. So that's why there is the argument out there that USPS, for example, because it stops at every single house, is probably going to be the most sustainable end of mile rather than the UPS truck that has to make an additional stop. That that gets complicated because you need to talk about what types of trucks and fuels are using, but that kind of insight is actually pretty interesting and does make a difference at scale. I will say though that's it's very easy when you use the life cycle assessment to spend 9 months and say, hey, let's get the entire carbon emissions profile from the seed that grows the tree that then is chopped down and manufactured into a box and then transported to the end of life. I think it's important to focus on the real hot spots and say okay, the leg of your going from your co-manufacturer to your distribution center, that's actually where you should really focus. This is all to say there's a million choices you can make. It's easy to get overwhelmed, but really honestly, you look at the average product and brand, there's probably 5 decisions that they're making that really account for the majority of impact that they can prevent.
Let's talk about those 5 decisions, because I think you're exactly right. So what's a couple of them? Where do we manufacture our product? Is that one of them?
Yes. So the buckets here you want to think about are transportation. Okay. And that means how long you're transporting it, by what means.
Right.
So that gets to the rail question. And so there's a lot of things you can do in there, which is okay, well, apparel is actually famous for this, about shipping things around the world a million times.
Right.
And similar to the example you gave. So if you can co-locate your vendors and distribution centers, or even plan a little bit, this is hard these days, plan a little bit better so that you don't have to air freight things last second, that's going to be huge. Those 2 things are a huge thing from a carbon standpoint. The other things are material choices and product design. So you see Amazon starting to talk about this a little bit with compact by design, which is related to transportation, which is again why the life cycle assessment is really important. Yep. So you want things to be compact. Imagine something bubble wrapped a million times. It actually really, something shows up on your front door. It's a giant box and something tiny. You're like, wait, why did they use this huge box?
We call that right sizing. Yeah. Yes. 100%.
Yes, exactly. So right sizing, light weighting, so using less materials, using materials that are recyclable. Yeah. And often use recycled content. Those together are really important things. Obviously, I'm being pretty high level here because it depends on the exact product we're using. But generally, those are kinds of buckets. Yeah,
I think you have to be, and that's like you said, sustainability means everything and it means nothing, because you could say something's recyclable, but if there's no place in the world that actually recycles it, technically it's recyclable, but my friend Avelia Matos says it's recyclable. Yeah. Yeah, I like to keep this PG, but we have to think about what will actually happen. People are talking about, biodegradable or compostable in your backyard. Do you know anybody that's putting plastic bags in their garden?
I'm so glad you said that. That's what I tell brands all the time. Why can you imagine eating spinach grown from a bed of plastic? And maybe it works, but yes, to your point, ultimately at the end of the day, we talk about data and sustainability attributes. It comes down to what is actually happening.
Right.
What do you think is actually likely to happen given where you live and the infrastructure around you?
Right.
And you have to be pragmatic about it, really. And that's why it's like, yeah, you can be making a choice to go with something that's biodegradable or bio-based. We talk about this as well, but like really like, and you can make those choices because customers expect it. That's one thing.
Right.
But if you also want to be rooted in like what's actually happening, what makes a net impact, that may be another thing that to be aware of.
Right.
Be different.
100%. And it's so interesting to me how companies are greenwashing. I just did a video about someone that had a number 7 on the bottom of their bag, and then they put a triangle around it. Now, listen, we all know that people will think that that means it's recyclable, but we know that number 7 means other, and it's garbage, and it should just say landfill. Put this in the garbage. We're sorry. We used bad material.
Yeah. It's regardless of the intent, out there, whether it's malintent or positive intent, it's confusing for both brands and the end consumers who are oftentimes just trying to do the right thing.
Totally. Well, you mentioned rock climbing. Tell us a little bit about that. I know that's off subject, but you said you're living in Tahoe. You're doing rock climbing?
Yeah, so I teach rock climbing classes, backcountry skiing, ski mountaineering. Cool. So yeah, and the idea is like, connecting people to nature in a place that's in a way that's kind of pushes yourself physically, emotionally. It's all based on problem solving and community too. So yeah, that's why I think it's important to live in a place like this and try to connect people to nature.
So many people I've interviewed on this podcast have been surfers or outdoors people or just connected to the environment somehow. And it makes sense to me that you and I and people like us who spend so much time outside or in the ocean are so focused on the planet being a healthier place. So yes. Nice work.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I mean, and likewise, it is funny. Sustainability by itself is hard. Doing a startup by itself is hard. I think it's having that fire with the end impact in mind, which for us really, we're a climate technology company. We're in business to decarbonize the consumer products industry. But even more so, like we know that people who work at these companies that are our customers are trying to do good. Yeah. And so we want to empower them to do good and make it easier. So that's like the kind of fire that's rooted in, being a surfer, being a rock climber or whatever, that powers you through all the difficulty in creating these businesses and impact.
Yeah, I love it. So what's next for Bluebird? You guys have any big plans for expansion or just keep kind of slowly adding on new clients, or what's the plan?
Yeah. So right now we're intentionally creating a pretty tight-knit pilot program. The reason for that is, like, we talked about the life cycle assessment. The output of that, for people who haven't seen it, is just a carbon number or a waste number that is really hard to then turn into like something that's helpful from a business perspective. And so what we're doing is taking a lot of cutting edge companies that want to innovate on sustainability communications to say, okay, like let's essentially work together to decarbonize our supply chains and products, and then figure out the right way to communicate that to retailers and customers. Because you can't just say like, oh, this has like a kilogram of carbon emissions. That is right. Not helpful to people.
What does that mean? Right.
Yeah. Is that better than average? Is that better than before? It's an invisible gas that somehow weighs a kilogram, which no one's even familiar with anyway. So yeah, we're spending a bunch of time over the next few months working with those customers. We have a slot or two left in the beauty and personal care space to really make sure we nail our product. We have our core technology down, which is awesome. It's validated by people who've been working at Patagonia and Unilever for a long time doing this stuff. But yeah, later this summer, we're essentially going to make it available to the public across CPG categories, which we're pretty excited about.
That's really exciting. So you've mentioned some really large companies there. Are they giving you access to all of their data, or are you giving them your software to plug their data into?
Yeah. And just to be clear, so those are our employees who have worked at those companies and are taking the state of the art. We are working with larger companies as well, like Beauty Counter and Velocity and some, but mostly cutting edge startups who are like really pushing the envelope. So from a data standpoint, this is actually one of the, if you ask a sustainability person about lifecycle assessments, you get one of a few reactions.
Yeah.
One is, oh yeah, we love being database. Another is, oh wow, it's way too complicated. And then the third, which is really common, is I've spent 9 months trying to get primary data to get this assessment. And that's for one product. So what we do is essentially create these algorithms, which another way of saying that is we're templatizing out all these supply chains for different product types to say, hey, here's how a prototypical skincare cleanser is made. And here are like the 5 pieces of data that give us 90% of resolution on carbon emissions and waste. So we're doing all this research that like sets all these defaults. And this is kind of like the secret sauce of what we do that makes it easy. So you don't have to go and ask your vendor and sub-vendor and sub-supplier all the data that they're never not going to know or want to give you. So we essentially get like data dumps from these companies or integrate into their data warehouses that house all this data. And then we do a bunch of processing and then make it usable. So the idea is like, you don't have to spend tons and tons of time hunting down data or like, with a deep integration. It should be easy to make comparisons across like 5 different product concepts with the information you have, supplemented by all of our like in-house algorithms that do a lot of like the harder work.
That's amazing. I was just talking about this before we came on, that I was at the SpecRight convention in Austin, Texas. And that's what they're doing. They're taking a spec first approach. So you take the specs of your packaging and you put it into their system, and then it's very easy to say, this is better than that, or that is better than this. And I think you're right. 9 months to gather data or specifications that's how a lot of companies were caught, in a panic, I should say, during the pandemic, because, supplier A, shut down. And we didn't have a supplier B. We don't know this, we don't know the spec of what kind of box this is, or we don't have the latest print for this, or so our supplier's supplier has that, it's like, whoa.
Yeah. And what SpecRight's doing is great, creating, essentially I don't, how to talk to them or not that familiar with them, but I've taken a look, and housing data for brands, it's like a really important thing to do, even for our brands. We see a lot of them having, working on Google spreadsheets, and a lot of the data goes into the software they have, whether it's SpecRight or some other one, like is of varying quality. But it really, there's a whole host of benefits for standardizing your data. Having sustainability outputs is definitely one of them, but I would recommend to a lot of companies at some point in their life cycle to take a look at it.
Yeah, well said. So you said you're accepting a few more clients into this pilot program. How much longer do people have to get a hold of you, and how do they get in touch with you?
Yeah, so first and foremost, the whole reason why I'm on this podcast talking to you, Cory, is to help people. And so this, for us, we know that this is a long play. We're trying to essentially just start relationships with any companies, regardless of what they're actually working on, if they want to make sustainability improvements and they produce consumer-facing products. So anyone can get a hold of me. My email is Jamie, Jamie, at bluebirdclimate.com. So as far as timing goes, if there's a beauty personal care company that is trying to make decisions now and really innovate on both decarbonizing their products and telling their customers about it, there's essentially have a month to get in touch. But really, there's no wrong time here. We're essentially just trying to start relationships with companies anyway. So always happy to take any call.
Well, I've never done this before, but I think I'm going to publish your episode right away. Usually I schedule it further out, but it sounds like this is kind of time sensitive. And my mission with LinkedIn Creator Program, they've asked me to be a part of I'm part of the LinkedIn Creator Accelerator Program. And my goal is to create a community of people that are working towards sustainable packaging. And so I think you're at the top of that pinnacle, and I really want to tell people about what you guys are doing. So I'll release this as soon as possible. So
I appreciate that, Cory.
Hopefully you can get some contacts right away.
Yeah, and if not, people can we're actually always putting out content as well that should be helpful. Even if people don't want to use software, we know that this stuff takes a long time to educate. So yeah, just get in touch, and we're happy to help in whatever way.
Great.
Takes an army.
Well, thank you, sir. I really appreciate you being on the show. And I'd like to thank Landsberg Aurora for your sponsorship. If you're listening to this, take a minute to review it and share it with your friends. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Cory.